So next, our next and final speaker is Angela MacDougall, who is the ED of, or coordinator of Battered Women's Support Services here in Vancouver, and who also is involved with coordinating the Valentine's Day Downtown Eastside Memorial March for Women, and her topic is on violence against women and children.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. It is really an honor to be here this afternoon and to have been asked by Ellen Woodsworth, and I'm so grateful for the organizing committee of Women Transforming Cities, and to be able to be here with Chris Morrissey, who I have a long history with, which I'll maybe get a chance to talk a little bit about. It's wonderful to see Chris here. And I must give gratitude to the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam people for this beautiful territories, Coast Salish territories. My people don't come from this territory that we now, this land that we now call Canada. My father comes from Ghana, and my mother comes from Sweden by way of Sepni in Sami territory in the north. And I was born in Vancouver, and Vancouver is my hometown, and I love this city. There's no part of the city that I don't delight in, being born here. And I have raised my daughter in Vancouver, and it's an honor and a privilege to be a mother and to be in this beautiful city and to do this work that is about the work to end violence against women. Every day I get to basically do a backflip every day because I get to work for Battered Women's Support Services that has been based in Vancouver and doing work to end violence against women since 1979 in a whole bunch of different ways. And one of the ways that we've worked and that I've had the privilege to work alongside before I became executive director was through participating at the Women's Memorial March, the February 14th Women's Memorial March, which started 22 years ago in 1991. And the Memorial March grew out of family members who were doing ceremony for their daughter, their sister, who was found murdered in the downtown Eastside, Vancouver. And the ceremony was an opportunity for the family to honor her life. And for 22 years, the February 14th Memorial March has met on February 14th and has taken the opportunity to draw attention to violence against women in the downtown East Side. And we cannot talk about violence against women in Canada, 21st century understanding of violence against women in Canada, without clearly understanding the role of colonization as a driving force in the very making, clearly, of this nation as a nation. And all of the economic policies that were aligned with colonization and the ways in which cities were formed based on an understanding of colonization and the role of settlers and the role in which women played within families and within communities, and the stratification that was inherent in this ideology that was the basis of colonization, including white supremacy, including male dominance, and including particular pieces around economies. And what we have all across this nation, Canada, now, within the urban settings, are essentially, we can call them, for the purposes of understanding violence against women, sacrifice zones. Zones within the cities that have been determined to be places where men can come and do violence against women with impunity, where all of the social concerns that we have around, well, male dominance, racism, poverty, grind down. And you know what I'm talking about. We have these across the country, and not only in Canada, but we're talking about Canada. And the downtown East Side was certainly a sacrifice zone in terms of violence against women, specifically. Certainly a place where there was significant apathy around male violence. And for a period of over 22 years, We have seen horrific levels of violence against women in that neighborhood specifically, and rendered invisible. And the part around where cities have a responsibility here and thinking about sacrifice zones within the city in terms of violence against women, the piece that's very important, I think, is the ways in which the fog kind of comes over the issue of violence against women specifically. There's this fog that just surrounds our vision when we want to talk about this concern. And we've seen this over and over again in terms of how law enforcement responds across the board in terms of sexual violence, the most underreported violent crime, the worst outcomes in terms of convictions. We've seen this across the board in terms of how cities have neglected to provide funding for groups that are working to redress the effects of violence in women's lives. And one of the things that we've seen in Vancouver, which has been remarkable and notable and necessary, is women's resistance. Just straight up and down women's resistance, which has involved taking the streets, being in the street, when necessary, when talking to law enforcement, when talking to city officials, when talking to those in government, was no longer working, or when it didn't work, taking the streets and being in the street. And the February 14th Women's Memorial March has been one example of that. And it is important to acknowledge this piece, which I guess is called civil disobedience. I like to think of it as standing in power and finding voice and making visible that which is rendered invisible. And in 2010, after 20 odd years of apathy in terms of law enforcement addressing violence against women in Vancouver, and understand that we had, for a period of time, a very prolific serial killer operating in this city, who acted with impunity for a significant amount of time, who has 14 murders of women have been attributed to this one person. And he wasn't the only one, let me tell you. And we had our city officials, we had law enforcement and the provincial government literally ignoring this, blaming women for their own disappearances. How could that be? We have to look deep in our hearts and ask that question. How could that be? How could that really and truly be? That we would, create a climate within our city that would permit that level of apathy when members of our community are dying and going missing. How could that be? And so we're here now in 2013, and one of the things that was very important in 2010, that was another turning point in how this, Vancouver, how we looked at this, is that members of the February 14th Women's Memorial March Committee, after a suspicious death of a woman, now understand that we're talking about women who, in large part, are Indigenous women, who have, as a result of economic policies and colonization, been driven to the city, who've been displaced due to resource extraction in their homelands, displaced as a result of reserve system, displaced as a result of the effects of colonization and residential school, and have come to the city in order to have a better life, to have a place to be, to have a community. In 2010, there was a suspicious death of a woman, young woman, and it's important when I talk about the murders and disappearances of women in the city. I have to tell you that for many of the women that we're talking about, they aren't actually women. They are girls. And so this young woman, Ashley Machisnik, suspicious death. And we had another example where the Vancouver Police Department ruled her death a suicide almost immediately without investigating further. And it was a catalyst, certainly, for those of us who had been a part of the committee who were just done. Like, this is not on. And we organized a memorial for her, and we occupied the police department, and with a letter to give to our chief at the time, which continues to be our chief, Chief Jim Chu. And at this point, we were just convinced that this is it. Like, it's over. We have to have a change. And talking wasn't working. So we occupied the police department, 8 of us, 3 of us were arrested. And it was a turning point in part because of the ongoing resistance of the women. And that, I think, is important when we think about, cities. And the level to which there's this fog that is over this issue of violence against women, and how do we break through this fog? What will break through this fog? What will shock, people into sitting up in their seats and saying, okay, what can we do? What will that take? And the role of resistance is important in our organizing. It's necessary, it's healthy. And it has been incredibly important for this city. And with the leadership of our chair, Marlene George, who just retired, and our elder, Rita Blind, it has been an incredible piece as far as redressing the effects of colonization by ensuring that Indigenous women are the lead and defining our steps forward. Because in order to redress these effects, we have to look at the roots. As long as we're throwing Band-Aids over the top, the roots will continue to fester. The fog will continue to be thick. I am so grateful for the women in the downtown Eastside and all of the organizing women who have done that work, because it's been remarkable how we've been able to work as a committee for 22 years. One of the things that grew out of that occupation, 2 things. We were learning that a shelter that was funded by our city, women were being sexually assaulted in a shelter. Imagine that. Imagine. And again, the apathy around anybody wanting to sit up and say, oh, we got a problem here, what should we do? The extent to which women were blamed for their rapes within the shelter. The extent to which the police were ignoring, the extent to which the officials of the shelter were ignoring, the extent to which the city. And we took the streets, once again, in order to break open that fog. And I'm very grateful for the willingness of our city officials. One of the things that I think that we've seen that's been quite remarkable is applied learning. You know that thing, you learn something, and then you apply it. We've had some of that. We've seen some of that within the Vancouver Police Department. They've applied some learning with respect to this issue of violence against women. We've seen some of that with respect to the city. They've applied some learning. That shelter is changed. Women are no longer being sexually assaulted there. They've created some things that, it looks like that, there's some kind of preventative things there now. And we've created a committee within the Vancouver called Sister Watch, which is law enforcement and community members, more specifically from the downtown east side. And we look at policies and practices, and we look at issues, we bring cases, and we address issues, and we hold the police accountable. Another piece that grew out of that is a task force around and within the city that addresses sexual exploitation. And the task force is an excellent task force. It is chaired by Mary Claire Zach, who is a city staff, and she is outstanding. And that task force is taking real action in terms of policy and practice, and more things are emerging in a number of different ways over the next while. But none of this came easy. It came from 22 years of organizing, women organizing, eventually occupying the police department, women getting arrested. And I just want to add that to the continuum of our strategies when we're looking at all the things that matter. That women's organizing, grassroots, disciplinary, multidisciplinary organizing, that there's a role for being in the street. And the battle's not over. We are working every day in terms of continuing to try and hold the police accountable, because that stuff is deep. We're working every day in terms of addressing the effects of colonization, because it is, from our point of view, one of the most contributing factors. And Chris mentioned that she was just at the Canadian Council for Refugees. Cities will have to understand that we will be dealing with more and more increasing effects of climate change and the effects of migration as a result of climate change. We'll be dealing with more and more things around people having to leave their homelands as a result of strife. There are more and more issues that we're going to have to be facing within cities, as not only in terms of the economies and the effects of unfettered capitalism and globalization, and the austerity measures that we're seeing. We'll be faced with more and more, and violence against women is where this grinds down. It grinds down in the private, in our homes, and it grinds down publicly. And wherever we are in our lives and in our work, we must find a way to support women's resistance in all of its forms. We must find a way to ensure that there is a lens that includes violence. And there's lots of women in this room, and so I don't have to tell you the numbers and what we're all up against. And it is as a result of the power of us, this thing about standing in our power and using our voice every opportunity that we have and that we get and that we take in order to achieve liberation. Thank you.